Hi everyone! Because this is going to be my 200th posted video, I thought I would try something a little bit different today and do my own original tag for BookTube. Now, obviously, because I'm not exactly the most well-known person on BookTube, I don't imagine particularly many people will see the tag and want to do it. But obviously, if you do like my questions for the tag and you want to do it, obviously consider all you guys watching to be tagged, and obviously, tag your friends and stuff like that. I decided to call this the Hendecad Hodgepodge because I absolutely love alliteration, and Hendecad means a group of 11 objects, and 11 is my lucky number. I just absolutely, love it so much. Like when many people do, their top 10 list, I do my top 11 list because, like, why not include my lucky number in absolutely, everything. And so anyway, these are obviously like they're questions about, topics and people that are, important or special to me or related to my writing. And I found, related prompts about books and authors and stuff like that. Number one, Paul Klee, my favorite artist, was born exactly a century before I was. Who is an author you love, or one to explore, one to get to know more about? Who shares your birthday? And obviously, I realize this question can be a little bit tricky. I was looking myself at Wikipedia at people born on the 18th of December, and there weren't a lot of authors. So, if there aren't many authors you can find who share your birthday, or they're just like people you're genuinely not interested in, like, don't force yourself to like say you're interested in them just for the sake of answering the question. The alternative for this is much easier: a book about an artist and art. And I decided to go with Narcissus and Goldmund by Hermann Hesse, my second favorite writer. I have a whole playlist about Hermann Hesse. I do plan to add many more videos to that in future, and I haven't yet reviewed Narcissus and Goldmund on video, but it's absolutely one of my absolute, favorite Hesse books. My favorite of him, my favorite all-time book is Damien, and then, like Steppenwolf and Narcissus and Goldmund. It's about two best friends during the Middle Ages, and, like Narcissus is like the monk. He's, very spiritual, pious, a little bit of a goody-goody, while Goldmund, comes to the monastery, but he realizes early on, this just isn't the life for me. I want to like run away and discover art and like women and have worldly experiences. And like over time, he decides he wants to create a dream Madonna, an image of the Virgin Mary, like, combining all these like experiences he's had with women. And he discovers one night, I've used this like observation many times in my own writing, even like, outright referenced it. One night across his wanders in Germany, Goldmund sees a woman giving birth, and he's like absolutely shocked because like the look on her face at this moment of great agony, it's so similar to the look on a woman's face and, like great ecstasy during a sexual experience. And he starts trying to put that into, the dream Madonna face as well. And so it's just like wonderful. He gets, apprenticed to different artists. I absolutely love art, and like medieval art. Many people think, oh, there wasn't really much art in the Middle Ages. It really got jump started in the Renaissance, and that is, kind of true. But obviously, there were seeds being planted during the Middle Ages, and this isn't, also I should add, it's not like really a traditional historical fiction novel. Obviously, yes, it does take place in the Middle Ages and have many historical details, but it's more like literary fiction that just happens to be set in the past because, Hermann Hesse was not, a historical writer. And I do really, really highly encourage you guys to check out Narcissus and Goldmund. It's got art, medieval art, like the Middle Ages, the Black Plague, like best friends, like just so many awesome, wonderful things. Number two, I recently finished writing possibly the most like intense thing I have ever researched or written. It was for my magnum opus Cinnamon, which spans the years 1941. That'll wrap up in 2050. And I decided to jump ahead a bit from 1998 so I could get the 9/11 section out of the way. I'm really, really glad I don't have to dread looking forward to that. It was just like I can't like express in words. I was having like physical reactions to my research, and like just it was totally unexpected. I guess I have a lot of repressed secondary trauma, but obviously that's a subject for another thing. But anyway, the during my research for this, I discovered that one thing I wish I had not had to research. Like if I hadn't needed to learn this information for my writing, I don't think I would have looked it up myself. The physical remains of 9/11 jumpers. Like I urge you, unless you have to do it for research like I did, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And did I mention don't do it? It's just like you can't unsee those images. I thought I was going to throw up. So in that vein, a book you regret reading or would strongly caution others against reading. And this isn't to be confused with like, oh, just a book you hated or a book you thought was like boring or by an author you later lost interest in or decided to, cancel or unhaul or whatever. And so this one, I went with the trashy Albert Goldman biography, The Lives of John Lennon. Like the best thing I can say about Albert Goldman is that at least he wasn't quite as like low and sleazy and like libelous and slanderous as Jeffrey Giuliano, but at least he had some kind of boundaries. But this book, I absolutely loved it when I read it when I was 14 years old, and then I turned 15 during the reading of it. For most of the time I was reading it like through the library when I was visiting there, and then I finally got it out of the library. Oh, now so like read it at like Barnes and Noble and Borders and stuff. It was just this. I loved this book at the time. And I'm looking back as an adult, I was absolutely shocked. I loved it and believed every word, because when I was at Mystery Train Records in Amherst, Massachusetts, I think I was like 20, probably 21 at the time, and I was looking through an old issue of People. They also had vintage issues of magazines there, in addition to obviously the vinyl records and the cassette tapes and CDs, which was most of what they have. And like people were talking about this then recently published biography, and I was like really shocked. Oh, these people are saying it's not true, and he didn't conduct all these interviews. And then I started doing more research, and I found out, yeah, a lot of this stuff was absolutely, made up. And I was so naive at the time. I didn't realize he was making up these like unflattering stories, or like severely decontextualizing them to make John and Yoko seem like the wicked witches of the West. And like he couldn't even be entirely, consistent. Like, oh, he's describing Yoko as a careful Oriental cook in one section, and then he's saying, oh, she couldn't even cook rice without burning it. So, which is it? And many times there's be a quiet family scene, or John is sitting by himself contemplating, and he's reporting on John's private thoughts, or this like private family conversation. Like, how would you know, dude, unless John wrote about this in a diary or a letter that was discovered, or he mentioned this in an interview? Like, why are you telling us his private thoughts he never articulated to anyone? So this book is just like, it's pure horse crap. I could not recommend this book more. And I have a whole blog post which I wrote about this based off of an old Angel Fire page, and I hope to turn that into a video in future. So if you want to know more details about this horrible book, look forward to that video. On a related note, question number 3. George is my favorite Beatle. Name a book about a spiritual journey or a spiritual character, because George was obviously very, very, famously spiritual, and I consider him one of my spiritual mentors, even though we never met. And to my knowledge, he never knew of my existence. He, passed away shortly before I turned 22. It's, hard to put into words exactly what, George and his music has meant to me, like throughout my entire life. It kind of makes me a little bit, emotional just thinking about it. And for this question, I went with Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. I do have a video about that in my Hermann Hesse playlist, and I've also reviewed the book on my main blog. The link to my blogs are down in my description box. And this is just an absolutely beautiful story of the search for enlightenment in ancient Nepal. Many people might be confused by the title of the book because they know Siddhartha was Buddha's real name, but no, it's not about Buddha, although Buddha, the historical figure, does appear himself in the book. And he gives Siddhartha like his blessing to go off and discover his own spiritual path. And at one point, Siddhartha like stays in a town for a very, very long time. He discovers pleasure and business and worldly goods and things like that. And then he eventually feels like, I'm really betraying myself. I want to get back with my spiritual journey and leave this town and discover enlightenment again. And so he goes and lives by a ferryman, Vasudeva, and he just gets so much great pleasure from taking the ferry back and forth. And obviously there's other stuff I'm not mentioning, like, for example, his relationship with his best friend Govinda, who decides to become one of the Buddha's monks, and his relationship with Kamala, a courtesan in the town which he's living in for 20 years or so, and just so many really, really beautiful things. It's a pretty short book, which many people might be surprised, because I'm all about the big deliberate door stoppers and chunkers you can climb into and live in for a few weeks. But Hermann Hesse was just the absolute master of the short books, 200, 300 pages you can breathe through in a day or a couple of days. His longest book, which I consider his worst book, The Glass Bead Game, it's he was totally out of his league writing a book that was almost 500 pages long. But Siddhartha is just such an absolutely beautiful book, and the ending is so moving when he achieves enlightenment. And it meant even more to me when I reread it at 42 years old than it did the first time around when I was 22. Number 4. The most recent album I wrote about on my blog has been Please Please Me, the Beatles' 1963 debut, and I wrote a 3-post series on it. You can obviously, again, check out my main blog in the description box. So, in that vein, name a debut novel you can't help but be charmed by. And surprise, I'm going again with my wonderful second favorite writer, Hermann Hesse, with his debut, Peter Kamenzind, which was published in 1904. I mentioned this in a previous video about top 10 books about friendship. That's in my top 10 playlist, and it's just such an absolutely beautiful like story about a young man coming of age in Switzerland, and he also goes to several other countries. Art is also involved, and one of the most beautiful like parts of the book is his friendship with an older cripple named Boppy, and like he was completely repulsed by Boppy at first, and then he kind of felt shame about himself, and they became, buddies. And there's a really, really moving scene during the friendship part of the book when they're at the zoo and they realize in like huge delight and surprise they've been using du, the familiar German form of you, with one another without realizing it. So that's just like a really, really beautiful thing. And there's, like love affairs, and Peter's father is like really angry at him because he's not, following the religious faith as, strictly as his parents would want him to. And like Peter's mother dies early on in the book, and like Peter's just sitting on the bed comforting her. She's been sick for a while, and his like father wakes up. It's like, how dare you, Peter? You let your mother die without getting a priest for last rites. Like, seriously, dude, your wife just died and you're like yelling at your son because he was, like comforting her in her final moments instead of, oh, let's run out to get a priest. Like, seriously. But obviously it's not nearly as, like good or polished as the later, Hermann Hesse novels, but definitely I would recommend it in its own right. It is, one of my like, second tier favorites of his books. So, obviously go check it out. I love Hermann Hesse, cannot recommend him enough. Number 5. An author you instantly knew had become your favorite, or one of your favorites. This is Alexander Isayevich Solzhenitsyn. I knew from the very first time I began reading him on the 29th of December of 1995. This was very shortly after I turned 16 years old, and this was the slightly short and censored version of the first circle. I believe it was like 85 chapters. The unexpurgated translation, which has since come out in the West, is like 96 chapters. And it was just, I was absolutely, drawn in from that, very first line about, like the hands on the fretwork clock. And like, the more I read, I was just getting more and more into it. I gave up going to lunch at school. I just like sat in the library, like during my lunch break, to read him. And I was like, reading him when I came home after school, or, at night when I was supposed to be in bed, or just like taking all my weekends doing it. And like sometimes I would sneak a little bit of food in the library, but not obviously like having a huge full lunch or anything like that. And I would like continue reading his books during my, classes. I was just like completely, drawn into this world. And I like wolfed so many of his books and stories and plays down during that was my sophomore year of high school. And then like I had a second wind of reading a lot of the rest of his books during 1999, like for example Invisible Allies, which is a very like special moving book. But he finally had the liberty back then to publicly acknowledge and thank the people who had done so much for like hiding his books and like smuggling them out to the West and like passing them along through underground channels in the Soviet Union. Just I highly recommend that book. Like, what book of his like don't I recommend? And I read a little bit about pretty much the last remaining of his books. I think that was, by that point it was mostly like plays and short stories and stuff, but there's still a few I have yet to get to. This was in my junior year of university, so basically there's not much left to. Number 6, I began making content again in 2021 in preparation for reciting Canto 1 of Inferno in the original medieval Florentine Tuscan Italian on Dante's 700th death anniversary, and I did it. That's still the video I'm absolutely, proudest of. All 136 lines, I still know them backwards and forwards all this time later, and now I'm finally getting back to working on my memorization of Canto 2. I'm about like 85-ish lines in by now. I'm definitely going to be doing a recitation video of that when I'm completely confident in my, mastery and fluency of those lines. And so anyway, you can name a book or an epic poem you have memorized parts of, intentionally or unintentionally. And I had to set myself a really lofty goal. I wanted to memorize the entire poem. Now I'm thinking maybe that's a little bit too ambitious even for me, but I would definitely like to memorize at least a few more cantos. Number 7. Despite my near lifelong interest in body modification, which is like, body piercing, like tattooing, scarification, suspension, all sorts of fun stuff like that, I always thought ear stretching was not my style at all. At age 35, I started admiring the beautiful new generation of plugs, eyelets, weights, saddles, and hangers on the market, but still didn't think I'd ever want to do that. In autumn 2021, surprise, surprise, at age 41, this was like only a few months before my 42nd birthday, I finally started doing it. Name a genre, author, a time period, or book you always assumed would never be your style, but you ended up falling in love with. Now for this one, I went for the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. I was never interested in like medieval anything until I was, late. I'm 22 years old. Even after I took a required course in medieval history, it's a history major at UMass Amherst, and this was taught by a visiting British professor from Harvard. So I can say I was taught by someone from Harvard, even though it was only a visiting professor for one class. I just didn't get into the Middle Ages at all. And as I've been saying for a very, very long time, once I have enough active engagement on my channel, like with like more people doing comments on every single video, so I know I wouldn't be like wasting my time on such a big endeavor. I'm going to do a long series on the Decameron, at least 115 videos to cover the 100 stories, like a general overview, my history with the book, my references to the Decameron and all of my own books, which I have written or edited since reading it, like the afterword, the introduction, the epilogue, just basically things like that. And it's just going to be a really, really fun series. Hopefully, I'm really, really looking forward to it. So like once I get more engagement, I would say not necessarily like, I thought maybe like 5-10 comments on each video, but one comment on each video, that would be enough to let me know, like people are actually like regularly watching my content. And I could not recommend this book more highly. And after I read it, I got really, really more into the Middle Ages. Obviously I'm still very like disturbed by the like undeniable like anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and also like it was very tough for women back then, and obviously other people who were like against the grain, not in the majority group. But like there were just so many other things about the Middle Ages, like rich culture, like literature, like art, music, just so many really cool, like architecture, just so many things. Like just don't dismiss it as, the Dark Ages, or there were bad things going on, so therefore you shouldn't even bother with like the entire era. And it lasted like like 1,000 years or so. So definitely there's going to be something in the Middle Ages you would be interested in yourself. So again, I really, really highly recommend this book. Number 8. My 99% handwritten magnum opus, Cinnamon, will eventually span 12 volumes, 110 years, and about 7 generations. Name a book or series spanning many generations. I went with Maisie Moscow's Raisins and Almonds series, which begins in 1905 in Manchester, England, and wraps up in 1991. It's about two very opposite Jewish families who have both like immigrated to escape persecution in continental Europe. The books are Almonds and Raisins, Scattered Seed, Children's Children, Out of the Ashes, and New Beginnings. And the Sandbergs are a very religious family from Russia. There were lots of pogroms sweeping the Russian Empire in 1905, and like this was absolutely a horrible event. And particularly the youngest boy, the youngest child at the time, Sammy, he was like permanently crippled because a horse ran over his legs, and like they all had to hide from the pogroms. And meanwhile, the Moritzes came from Austria, and they're much more like secular and assimilated. They're not completely like denying their Judaism type, secular lox and bagelers, but they're just like much less religious than the Sandbergs, and that creates a lot of cultural conflict between them. And there's eventually some marriages between the families. But I really hated Sarah, the matriarch of the Sandberg family, when she started getting involved in her children's love lives. Like, I don't think that's a good enough match for you. You should like break up with someone you absolutely love and who loves you and you're planning to marry, because this would be more financially advantageous. And just, dude, like stay out of your children's love lives and let them marry who they want to. It's just like when she became that annoying like busybody breaking up happy couples, it just made me so angry and just really could not cheer for her anymore. Number 9. A book you took a long break from or almost DNF'd and were glad you gave a second chance to. And this is again the Divine Comedy, which I started reading in December of 2003. Around the time I turned 24, I'll have to look back in my journal to see when exactly I started reading it, if it were like before or after my birthday. But it was just so like confusing and distracting for me at first, because all those damn footnotes talking about this is who this person is from like antiquity, or this is something a religious concept. And so I had to constantly interrupt my reading to look down at the footnotes. And also this is the Lawrence Binion translation, and he followed a style that's very common in that era. And unfortunately, I think some people still do it, but it's like not nearly as common as it used to be. Thankfully, he would do like faux archaisms and like Elizabethan English, so like trying to make Dante sound like Shakespeare, even though like medieval Italian never had equivalent like pronouns and grammar to Elizabethan English. So like that's really distracting, and like people just don't naturally read like that. I mean, Shakespeare is one thing because he actually wrote like that. That was his native form of English, even though it's obviously a little bit tricky to like understand some of what Shakespeare is saying sometimes. But seriously, dude, don't like force that style into a translation of a language that was never like that. And so I was just so frustrated. I put the book aside until like March or April of 2004, and then I went back to it with a vengeance, and I didn't look down at the footnotes nearly so often, and I had to mentally translate the annoying fake like Shakespearean style English into modern standard English. And so I was really, really glad I went back to it. My reading pace really, really picked up. It's one of my absolute all-time favorite books now. As you can, well, I obviously there are things like blocking the way, but these are like some of my translations of the Divine Comedy. I will be doing a future video on my bookshelf tour series talking more about the Dantean books on my shelf, and of course I have many more translations on my wish list, which I do plan to get in future. And so and again, look forward to some more Dantean content. I also have a playlist called All About Dante and the Divine Comedy, so check that out. I just recently added to it with probably the first video in a couple of months about like when exactly Dante may have been born, his birth date. Number 10. My favorite holidays are Halloween and Yom Kippur, which seem on their face like they're completely opposite. So name a book with juxtaposing elements, themes, characters, settings, etc. For this one, I went with Judy Delton's Kitty series, which I've mentioned in many, many previous videos. It's set in the 1940s in St. Paul, Minnesota, and it's about a girl going to Catholic school, Kitty, and her very, very opposite best friends, super duper religious Margaret Mary, and really, really rebellious Eileen, and how she's like, trying to be in the middle of them all the time and being pulled by, oh, you should go to daily mass, and then Margaret Mary gets mad when she finds out, oh, how dare you, Kitty, you've been going to mass every morning with me, and you're, making a game out of playing confession and like making up fake sins with Eileen when you go to her house, and then she's just like trying to make the peace between all of them. And it's like really, really fun and cute. And there's the prequel Kitty from the Start, and then there was Kitty in the middle, Kitty in the summer, and Kitty in high school. I really really wish that she had written way more books in this series and they had been a little bit longer. I've like reread this series again as an adult, and it holds up so well. I could not recommend these books more highly. They're just like so sweet and cute, and obviously like great historical fiction for the middle grade audience as well. Number 11, lucky number 11. For years, I wanted 8 kids, 4 boys and 4 girls, and I had their names picked out, both first and middle names. Now I'll feel lucky if I have even one biological child before time runs out. Though I used to have a recurring dream about being pregnant with and giving birth to quads, sometimes quints, and women my age are more prone to having naturally conceived multiples, even like higher order multiples like quads or quints, so like maybe I'll be blessed with like a surprise miracle. I still love reading and writing books about big families. What is one book or series you love with 5 or more siblings? For this one, it was like pretty easy. I looked through several, series and books with larger families, but like I chose for mine, Cheaper by the Dozen and the sequel Bells on Their Toes by Frank Gilbreth Jr. and Ernestine Gilbreth Carey, like about their like wacky family. This is a real story. Like on the modern movies called Cheaper by the Dozen, they have like jack to do with the actual like memoirs and the real family. They just like, oh, a family with 12 kids and they're having wacky adventures, but like absolutely nothing in the movies has like anything to do with anything in the books. It's like kind of like a slap in the face to these like real people, but like rant over. I read these books I read the first book. I think I've only read the sequel once, but I read the first book so many times. I memorized passages from it. There's so many like funny stories about like life in the early 20th century, and the parents are so different in their approaches to like discipline and like teaching the children at home and like general parenting strategies. And like, oh, people are so shocked. Oh, you have well, actually only 11 of them survived to adulthood. Sadly, they didn't mention until a footnote in the second book, Bells on Their Toes, that the second born child, Mary, sadly, she died of diphtheria when she was about 5 years old, like I think shortly before her 6th birthday. And it was just such an absolutely traumatic loss to the family. They just like never mentioned Mary again. So I kind of had to guess like the first or second time I was reading the book Cheaper by the Dozen, like why isn't Mary like appearing in all these family adventures? She's only mentioned like a couple of times at certain points, and I guessed out maybe she died, and then like I looked it up much later and I found that was right. I kind of wish they had like mentioned Mary and I hadn't had to like read between the lines, but it's like a really, really fun book. You'll absolutely love it if you haven't read it already. Thank you very much for watching. As I said at the beginning, please consider yourself tagged if you have watched all the way to the end, and tag your friends as well. But again, I have absolutely no expectations for this. Like maybe only like 3 or 5 people will end up doing this tag and it'll be quickly buried, but at least I can put myself out there and try something new, and I will see you guys again very soon in the next video. Thanks again for watching. Bye.